Hey, hello, welcome to bread making. So I've kind of cheated, and ahead of time I made a little bit of a sponge. You look at it, you can see hopefully that there are bubbles in it, and what the bubbles mean is that the yeast has been activated and it's busy doing yeasty things, which is to say it's taking the flour and breaking it down eventually into carbon dioxide, which is what the bubbles are, and once it does that, the carbon dioxide inside of the dough will actually, that's what makes the bread light and airy. We are using yeast for our raising agent. There are other alternatives, which kind of brings me to the first point that I want to make. And the reason I'm doing this is because people have been making bread for about 6,000 years. And in those 6,000 years, they've made bread pretty much every way you could possibly imagine. They've made it without any kind of raising agent, so no air bubbles in it. They've used yeast as a raising agent. They've used baking soda as a raising agent, soda bread or quick breads. So what I'm going to do is, because oftentimes this level of complexity and detail can be very intimidating, I'm just going to make the very simplest, basicest bread possible. And then, so you know, okay, well, this is how I can make bread. And then eventually you may decide to make it this way, or you may decide to make it another way. And there are an infinity of options, so I'm just going to present you one and you can decide what to do with it. So this particular sponge, not a sponge exactly, but we'll call it a sponge, is 100 grams of bread flour mixed with 100 grams of water. So I'm going to put it on my trusty digital scale, and step one is adding flour to your mixture. Now, bread makers do something that physicists do, and that is they say, okay, well, the amount of flour in your bread is 1, and you calculate everything else based on that. Physicists have this thing they do where they say, okay, well, let's assume the speed of light is 1 and then calculate everything else based off that. And the first time you see that, it's very strange. But then when you actually get into it more, you say, oh, well, it makes a ton of sense to assume the speed of light is 1. So the amount of flour is going to be 1, and then we're going to measure from there. So I've got 100 grams of flour. And in order to use a pound of flour, I'm going to add another 350. I hope I'm going to get it close. Okay, 351. Close enough. So I've got my flour. Now, bread, at its simplest form, what's called a lean bread, is flour, water, salt, and yeast. I put flour and water to make my sponge, and I've added yeast into it, which is where the air bubbles are coming from. So now I've added some more flour to it. So the next step is I'm going to add salt. Now, one of the reasons that you use the amount of flour is 1 is that the amount of salt you add is 2%. So if I have 454 grams of flour, which is a pound, which is what I do have, I would then want to add 2% salt, which is about 9 grams of salt. If I was making a larger loaf, a 2-pound loaf of bread, that would be 900 grams, and so I would add 18 grams of salt. If I'm making smaller loaves, again, if I have 200 grams of flour, I would add about 4 grams of salt to it. But I'm going to add 9 grams of salt now. And if you're feeling adventurous, you can just add a heaping soup spoon full of salt. That's going to be about 9 grams. It's going to be close enough. So let's see, flour. I've got all my flour in there. Water? Nope, not yet. Okay, salt, got it. Yeast, got it. Now, one of the other advantages to creating a sponge ahead of time is it activates the yeast. So if you have dry yeast and you're not sure when it was used last, making a sponge will see, okay, yeah, the yeast is good. Plus, it gives the yeast an opportunity to grow because the salt inhibits the growth of yeast. So I've got flour, I've got water, I need more water, and I've got salt and I've got yeast. So I've got 100 grams of water in here. And normally you want to make, it depends on your flour, but for your basic red flour, we're going to go with about 70%. So 70% of the weight of flour in water. I probably should have done this ahead of time, but I didn't. So we're talking about 320 grams of water. Since I have 100 in there, I'm going to need about 220 more, which coincidentally is about a cup of water. I use tap water, which, given that I'm in Chicago, might not be the smartest idea in the world because God knows what's in the tap water, but I've been making bread with it for years and haven't died yet. Okay, and there you go, cup of water, 221 grams. So I have a very basic lean dough, which is 70% hydration, which is absolutely run-of-the-mill hydration, and it's got flour, the yeast is activated, the yeast is going. I'm going to now take this, put this on my mixer, and mix it. If you're feeling particularly fanatical about, making dough in the old way, you should definitely not do that. You should kind of mix it by hand and then knead it. But kneading it is a pain, and it's really messy. So I'm just going to throw it on the mixer, and let's go ahead. I'm going to pause for a minute, and because the mixer's really loud, and you wouldn't be able to hear me talk anyways. Okay, back in a second. Okay, so I have run the dough on the mixer, and you can see I've got a ball of dough in my hand. And again, I don't know how much detail. Yeah, there you go. You can see the dough is really kind of rough. It's not fully mixed together yet, which is okay because I like to knead the dough a little bit. So while I'm kneading the dough, I've called this a lean dough a couple times. So the answer, so you're probably wondering, well, what is the other kinds of dough there are? And the other kinds of dough are what are called enriched doughs. If you start enriching your dough too much, then you start getting into the realm of sweet beds and pastry and things like that. So you want to stick to about 10% enrichment for a particular dough that you're making. So in the case of a dough with 1 pound of flour in it, you're talking about 45 grams of enrichment. Okay, so the next question is, what exactly is enrichment? And the answer is it's either sugar or fat. The particular kind of sugar or fat you add doesn't really matter. You want to add white sugar to it? Okay, throw in 45 grams of white sugar and you're going to have a good loaf of bread. Now, what the sugar does is it makes the dough, first of all, it makes it taste better. Lean breads are, kind of dry and can be kind of dry and tough, whereas an enriched dough is softer and tastes better because you put sugar in it. But the other thing it does is it helps to preserve your bread. So, if you add 45 grams of sugar to your 1 pound loaf, it's going to be longer before it goes bad. You can add granulated sugar, you can add brown sugar. If you feel like it, you could add confectioner's sugar. Can't imagine a situation where you'd want to add confectioner's sugar to bread, but you can. If you don't feel like adding confectioner's sugar, you could add maple syrup. 45 grams of maple syrup. You could add molasses. You could add honey. If you make whole wheat bread and you add a little bit of honey, that is a really good taste, which, shouldn't be that surprising. That's why they serve honey wheat bread all the time. So those are your sugars that you can add to enrich the dough. Alternately, you can add fat. 45 grams of butter. Make sure you soften it at room temperature first. Be careful about melting it. You could melt it, but the problem is you don't want to kill your yeast. And if the butter gets too hot when you melt it, you can kill your yeast. So 45 grams of butter is about 2 tablespoons. Quarter of a stick of butter. Quarter stick of butter. You could add 45 grams of olive oil. That's a good bread. You could add 45 grams of coconut oil. You can add whatever you want. When you're enriching your dough, you want to think about what flavors are you going to mix with it. So you might not want to mix, say, sugar and rosemary. If you have rosemary, you might want to go with olive oil. You know, if you're doing, say, you know, a more chili-based one, you might want to go with coconut for that. So, you know, think about balancing your flavors when you enrich your dough. But this dough is not enriched. It is a good lean dough. And so I'm just going to kind of fold it here. What I'm doing is I'm pulling it around so that you have a smooth surface here. And it's not as smooth as it could be. And it's now sticking to my hand. But that's okay. You know, because the good news is it will still be edible even if you don't make it perfect. It's a nice thing about bread, it's very forgiving. So I have a Banneton basket here. That's what these wicker baskets are called. I'm going to put my dough in it. And we're going to do the first rise, which is also called the bulk ferment or the first proof. Proofing and rising or ferment, that's all the same thing. Basically what we're doing is we're giving the yeast an opportunity to attack the rest of the flour, and when it does that, it breaks it down, it produces air bubbles, which is why they tell you to let the dough sit until it's doubled in size, and it also makes it taste better, which is why you want to ferment or rise or proof as long as you can. That's why people make sponges, to activate the yeast, but it also helps the taste. So anyway, I've got my bread. I have a proofing drawer, which is basically a little box that's maintained. I maintain it at 82 degrees because the apartment where I live right now is 65 degrees. And that's too cold for yeast. But 82 degrees makes the yeast happy and it breeds faster. Again, if you have time, you can let it sit at 65 degrees overnight. You'll get a rise eventually. You can even put it in the refrigerator overnight and let it rise. The rise is going to be very slow, but by extending the rise, that allows you to get better taste out of the bread. Of course, if you want to eat bread, then, you know, spending 3 or 4 days letting your dough rise, probably not a bad idea unless you know you're going to be hungry in 3 or 4 days. So that's the balancing act. In theory, you could get a loaf of bread in an hour and a half, 2 hours. You can make a loaf of bread. It'd be very, you'd have to force the rise. You could only do a single rise instead of 2 rises like you normally recommend, but you could do it. Or you could go, there's a recipe I've seen for 96-hour, 4-day pizza dough. And if you have 4 days that you're willing to wait for pizza, or you know 4 days ahead of time you want to make pizza, really, really tasty dough in 96 hours. So anyway, the dough is in the Banneton basket, and I'm going to pause again, and I'm going to step away from for an hour, and we're going to come back and take a look at how the first rise went. The metric you use is it should approximately double in size. So you kind of have to guess, but the point is that the yeast should be creating air bubbles and the dough should look larger, noticeably larger. And when it does that, you can say, okay, yeah, I've done that. So here's how the dough looks right now. Nice little lump of dough. It does not have a smooth top because I really didn't do a good job with that, but that's okay. If you weren't fermenting it in a proofing basket, you'd want to cover it with a damp cloth because the crust will form on the bread. The proofing drawer that I have has a little water table, a little water container in it, and so it's very humid in there, so I normally don't cut the crust, so I don't cover it. So anyway, off to do the ferment. And the thing you'll notice about bread is, you know, I think I've been talking for about 10 minutes, but now I'm going to go away for an hour. I'm going to come back and talk for a couple minutes, go away for another hour, come back and talk for a couple minutes, go away for half an hour, come back, and then I'll have bread. So there's a lot of time on the clock invested in bread, but it's not a lot of time that you spend on it. So anyway, loaf of lean bread, 70% hydration, so that's 320 grams of water, 450 grams of flour, 9 grams of salt. The yeast was pre-started and fermented, and that's what's in here, and we're going to let the yeast do its job. Back in a bit. Thanks. Alright, here we are back with our bread. We've given it an hour. We have in fact seen some changes in the bread. You can see it has definitely risen. The surface looks a little bit smoother, And what that is the rise is from the yeast putting carbon dioxide bubbles in it. The problem is that the dough can only support so much, so many bubbles in it, and that's based on the amount of water we've added and so on. So if we're going to do a second proof, which we are, we need to knock the air out. If we don't do that, then the dough will keep expanding, and then at some point it'll just collapse on itself once it's no longer able to support all of the air that's inside it. So we're going to take the dough here, just going to fold it, punch it down. Now, next step, and again we get into options at this point. If you want to take a chunk of dough like this, you can make it into a loaf of bread. You can make it into a freestanding loaf of bread. You can make it into a loaf of bread in a mold. You can make it into a cob or a circular type bread. You can cut it in half and make it into two smaller loaves. You can, there's an infinite number of things that you can do with the bread. But we're going to do one thing, and this is just kind of, again, just focused on, here is something that you can do with bread to make it that's relatively easy. So again, I'm kind of folding it to get get that smooth surface on the outside. And that surface tension just gives you the surface tension, which is the smooth outside when you kind of pull the dough around. That just gives you better rise, and then when it bakes, it gives you better crust. So I've got a loaf pan right here, and I have put my bread in my loaf pan. Now, the way these things are, I'm going to go away for another hour. I'm going to watch another show. I watched an hour-long show, come back and check on the bread, see that it's risen. I'm going to come back about halfway through the rise, and I'm going to start heating the oven. How hot you want to cook and how long you want to cook for, that's another one of those things that's really variable. So I'll talk about that when I get there. But again, really simple. Just kind of take the dough, knock the air out of it, and then give the yeast a chance to start fermenting again and start bringing that good flavor to the bread and put the air pockets back in. So again, we're going to get another rise on the dough. So, see you in an hour. Alright, so hour actually wasn't long enough for the second rise. I came back to check on it, hadn't risen enough, so gave it an extra half hour, which is one of the reasons why you do not bake bread if you are in a hurry. You can see, got a good rise on the loaf. So at this point, you have a couple options. You can just throw it in as is and call it done, or you could score the top. Really, that's up to you, however you care to do it. I'm going to keep this as simple as possible, not score the top. For oven, you can cook it anywhere from 350 to 450. I'm going to go down the middle, and I'm going to cook at 400. And because I have cooked this particular loaf at this temperature before, I know it's going to take me about 30 minutes to cook. Since I am cooking in a loaf pan, it is pretty hard to pull it out and check the difference, check if it's done. So there is going to be a certain amount of trial and error involved in that. Luckily, I have made a lot of errors, so 30 minutes should suffice. So I will see you in 30 minutes. Alright, time for the moment of truth. We've taken the bread out of the oven. I gave it 2 extra minutes because I want to really make sure it was done. Looking at it, good crust, not too hard, not too soft, a little crispy. Before we cut it, we'll just take a look. You can see it's cracked here. Had we scored the bread, the steam inside the crust would have broken out in the score, so we wouldn't see these cracks, but I prefer the bread like this. But the real test is when you go and cut it down the middle and take a look at the crumb of the bread. So here you go, you can take a look at it. First thing you do, if you're not sure how your bread came out, is you check right along the bottom here, because this is going to be the last bit that's going to get done. And looking at it, it's done. You tap it with your finger, feels good. You can see the steam coming off of it, so it's not cooled down yet. Ideally, you like to let your bread cool all the way down, but you know, who wants to wait to eat bread, right? And then looking at the rest of the crumb on the bread, you can see there are some air bubbles in there. We got a good rise. Could have gotten a better rise, but overall this is okay. This is a decent loaf of bread. You know, you can take it, make PB&J out of it, make sandwiches out of it. You can just eat it straight up. It's going to be really good. Again, it's a lean loaf, so it's going to be a little bit drier and tougher than an enriched loaf, but overall, very pleased with the experience. Hope you learned something from this. Thanks.